Welcome, everyone, to the December Acton Lecture Series. My name is Dan Churchwell, and I serve as the Director of Program Outreach at the Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce today for our December Acton Lecture Series, Dr. Justin Beene. Justin lives with his wife and 3 children in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He holds a Bachelor of Social Work from Western Michigan University, a master's in social work and management of human services from the University of Michigan, and a master's in ministry leadership from Grand Rapids Theological Seminary. He earned his doctorate in transformational leadership with a focus on entrepreneurial transformation. Justin is the visionary founder of an innovative partnership here in Grand Rapids called the Grand Rapids Center for Community Transformation, a collective between nonprofits and social enterprises in the Grand Rapids area, helping to create the flourishing city that is the ideal for what we're looking for with the ideas of the Acton Institute. Today, for our December Acton Lecture Series, he will be discussing transformational leadership in a time of crisis.
Well, welcome to Transformational Leadership in a Time of Crisis here at Acton on Tap. And so excited to be able to have this time together, and thank you all for joining in to this important conversation. And hopefully you're excited to kind of learn and listen, but then also really engage in some real back and forth and some dialogue. There's no doubt about it, this past year has been a crisis, has been traumatizing, has been a whole lot of things for a number of reasons. And I thought, in thinking about what to share, this really became a good opportunity to really talk about this. What does it mean to lead with your family and your organization and your business and your church? Whatever it is that you have some leadership, authority, influence in and over, or as some would say, the weight that you leave, those things that you influence. How are you leading those things? How are you taking stewardship responsibility over those things in a time of crisis? Because in a time of crisis, we lose perspective. And so those were 2 kind of questions for thought to really begin to frame our conversation. One is what dream for your community, your family, or organization, again, the thing that you have in your control or authority over. What dream do you have that is emerging for you during this time? And be thinking about that, because I think that's a critical piece to what we're going to talk about. I think number 2 is back to perspective, is what new lens has been transforming your perspective? And maybe you don't have a lens that's been transforming your perspective, and that's why you're here engaging with us today, and hopefully we'll be able to give you a few pieces of information that allow you to begin to have a new lens for this time. For this time, as I would say, is transformative if you let it. We're always being formed. The question probably is, what are you being formed into? Is the challenges and the changes and the rapid disruptions happening, are they forming you into becoming more human, more like the person of Jesus, more of a leader who embraces those challenges and the skills that you have to engage those? Or are you running away? Are you hiding? Are you being frustrated? And are you losing your perspective to be intentional and on purpose? So the reality of our world today is that it's changing fast. It's been changing fast. And a lot of the past year has really highlighted many of those changes. One of the mega trends that I've been tracking for a number of years is the fact that we are living in a new urban reality. That new urban reality says that today we're living with a population, 54% of the world's population is living in a city or in a metropolitan area. You can see on the PowerPoint in 1910, only less than 5% of the world's population lived in cities. And it's trending that almost 70% of the world's population will live in cities in the next 20 years. That's 100% of the world's population growth will be absorbed by cities. And so cities are what I like to say, both a magnet in that they're attracting people to it, to come for services, for opportunities, but it's also a magnifier. It's magnifying the challenges that maybe we've already had in cities. It's magnifying the injustices. It's magnifying the differences between religion and politics. And this is not just happening in our city here in Grand Rapids, which is clear, but also in cities across the US and across the globe. Another one of those things that are massively changing, in addition to the demographic shifts, which I would say which include the reality of same-sex marriage, the reality of mixed race marriages. In fact, currently, millennials now outnumber baby boomers, 71 million millennials. We also have a megatrend that's affecting our world is technology and AI advancements. Some are saying that in the next 10 years, automation and technology, artificial intelligence will displace 30% of the world's population. We're wondering, what are we going to do about the increasing level of pandemics and natural resources and sustainability? In fact, 2 years ago, I was in Cape Town, and after a few days in Johannesburg, a few days in Pretoria, went to Cape Town, and this was just for some rest and relaxation. Got to the hotel, and the concierge said, please do not take a shower unless you absolutely have to. Interesting enough, Cape Town, like many other cities, are now beginning to see that their water table is running dry. And so they were taking drastic effects to save the amount of water that they had left. In addition to these megatrends, the demographic shifts, we also have burnout, employee engagement. In today's workforce, 16% of people are actively disengaged from the workforce. And in fact, we're at an all-time high of employee engagement, which is only 31%. And so now when we come to the realities of working from home, our kids who are oftentimes in virtual school, mom and dad not having an easy turnoff of when does work end and when does it start. We are living through a traumatizing time. And oftentimes we've lost perspective. We've lost what it means to lead. And we oftentimes don't have a process to help us through that. There's additional disruptive forces for many nonprofits and churches and even businesses. This purposeful experimentation demand on nonprofits, and yet there's a force to integrate science and to have evidence-based practices. We're seeing that large organizations are beginning to be more and more dominant, but people themselves probably are less interested in the organization or the business itself and more interested in the cause. So what does that mean for us? We're living in an information liberation, not only for us in the workplace, but also for our children with everything at their fingertips. And so when we look at all of these things that are affecting us, if you are feeling overwhelmed, which I would place myself in that category, we tend to be challenged in how to sort through all of this information, all of these things happening, and how to lead with integrity. And so I'd like to introduce this process, call it the transformative or transformational process. Again, this idea of what is forming you. We're all being formed, but what is forming us and what are we being formed into? And so for many of us, the majorities of our days are spent doing something or acting. Although we're learning that busyness or doing activity doesn't necessarily mean learning. It doesn't necessarily mean growth. And so far too often do we take the time to reflect on our experiences and our beliefs. The things that are actually underneath our action, underneath the results that we see in life are those experiences and beliefs. And so how do we begin to reflect on those experiences and then choose greatness and prioritize over just the good things? I call this moving towards our intentional or towards our transformational future. The reality of needing a process to take a step off of what sometimes feels like the rat race, where we're just going through the motions or we're kind of on the hamster wheel, moving and moving but far too often on autopilot. Especially for me, I know that oftentimes even with my children, it's like, hey, Dad, where are you? Because I'm thinking about all of the things that I have going in my life. And that's not intentional. That's not on purpose. So I want you to take a look at this process and begin reflecting on, again, those questions of what dream for your community, for your family, is beginning to emerge for you. What new perspectives can you have? The reality is that we can only act within the world we see. I love this quote by Stanley Hauerwas, because is there 3 or is there 4 sticks? Right? And in so many ways, it depends on where you stand. And so in this extremely rivalistic and divisive world that we live in, we end up standing on one side and yelling to the other, trying to convince them that our way of seeing is right. And that perspective has really gotten us nowhere. The divisive politics, the challenges that we have in urban communities are going to continue to be magnified. Part of being a transformational leader is to recognize your own limited capacity and your own limited perspective. To say that in community, great things can happen. New perspectives, new ways of seeing and being and acting in the world are in fact possible. So I would beg to say that for any real leadership development to happen, self-knowledge becomes a prerequisite. Taking the time to reflect, to be present with your own self, to recognize what I say, your own flaws, your own challenges become the beginning of you healing your families, healing your communities. I'll say that maybe a little different way. I like to use this quote: what does it mean to love our city, or love our company, or love our family into greatness? This loving something into greatness is because people, just like things, over time begin to bear the mark of those who love it. See, that's that two-way process of love, is that people and places over time begin to bear the mark of those who love it. But love is not just a one-way, me seeing something and wanting to fix it, per se, me seeing something and wanting to just partake in what it gives me. It's loving something in spite of its flaws, seeing the brokenness in something and loving it in spite of it, this broken world, but also recognizing your own flaws and being willing to allow others to love you because of it. So I want to offer 2 kind of quotes to help us define transformational leadership, and then I want to just make it practical before we get more into the question and answer. So I love this definition by Robert Terry. He says that leadership is the courage to call forth authentic action in the commons. And in the commons, he doesn't mean necessarily those common pheasants, those folks over there, but it's just the public square, right? So leadership is the courage to call forth authentic action in the public square. And there's 2 main things about that I really love about this quote. One is that it's individual and it's communal, right? It's both my own courage, or what I love to say, Brene Brown's quote of kind of, there's never good leadership, there's never courage unless there is also fear or anxiety close by. So leadership requires courage, it requires vulnerability to then call forth authentic action in the community for the public good. The calling forth part of love is that it's already latent. As one of my mentors used to always say, that the Holy Spirit precedes us in all things. And so we're calling forth as leaders in our family, in our employees, in our community, what is already there. So it's an asset-based approach, saying what is present in our family, what is present in our business, what is present in our church, and courageously calling forth that to a bigger vision. The second quote is that leadership is a primary way in which God makes us over into his image and likeness. Now think about that. Maybe instead of leadership, you could use responsibility or authority, but that's what leadership is. Those things that you have influence, authority over, responsibility for. That leadership responsibility is a way in which God makes us over into his image and likeness. And that's because it takes increasing levels of vulnerability and risk-taking. Again, back to this idea of love and transformational leadership being a two-way process, is that in order to continue to lead our family in a time like this, it requires an increasing level of vulnerability and humility, and I'll talk about that in a second. Second is it requires increasing levels of integrity. Is that leadership in a time like this is not something that you can kind of make up as you go. It does require a certain set of rhythms, a certain set of understanding your own personhood and humanity, both its positives and its challenges. And so how do we make this, I think, increasingly on the ground? What does it mean for us in the day-to-day? And John Cotter has his book, 8 Steps of Change. And I'm only going to talk primarily about one of these, but here's the 8 that I think are really, really important for us during this conversation. So he goes through these 8 steps, and he's really the guru of change management. He says, first is that we have to establish a sense of urgency. Okay, when thinking about leadership during a time of crisis, there has to be a sense of we got to do something right now. And in many ways, I think for all of us, we are aware of that. We're aware of that sense of urgency. It's all around us. Things are changing. 2 is the importance of building a guiding team. Who are those around you that God has placed? 3, we're going to talk about, because I think is really, really important around this idea of the transformative perspective. Then communicating that vision and getting others to buy in, whoever those are around you. Empowering others to act on this vision, right? You as the leader probably removing as many barriers as possible. Then generating short-term wins, helping people to see that it is actually important and effective. Consolidating those and then making it stick. So the main one I think for today, but I want you to see the bigger picture of steps to change, is really developing a vision for change. And again, this idea of when does burnout happen? When is the church really in a position to step up and be that prophetic voice? Is oftentimes when there's a crisis. And so I think now is the time to be talking about I think that as Christians, we're supposed to always have an optimistic vision for the future. In the midst of what feels like chaos, how do we develop a powerful picture, a powerful vision of what the future could be, even though there's lots to complain about? Think about that. Have you ever thought about what your kind of life vision statement is? We obviously have mission statements and vision statements for our organizations or churches, but what about for your own life? What about for your own family? And have you pulled that back out during this time of crisis to keep us grounded, to give us a new perspective or a refreshed perspective, and then communicate that with others of what is it that we actually want? I love the story of Jesus. He's walking with his disciples and he sees the blind man who's probably been screaming many a times as Jesus and the disciples have walked by. And this one time Jesus decides to stop by and he asks the blind man, what is it that you want? I'm pretty sure that Jesus and the disciples knew what the blind man was struggling with. But it was important for him to articulate his vision. And he said, I want to see. I think that's true for us in the midst of all of the things that hold us captive to a pessimistic vision of the future, that one that says, oh, the world is ending and maybe we should just give up. As a leader, we're supposed to call forth authentic action. We're supposed to have a vision that then invites other people into it. How does it clarify that direction of your family or organization and why it needs to move? And how is it clear and compelling? So I'll just share a couple examples. For myself, a few years ago, I came up with my own kind of life vision statement, which is to courageously facilitate transformative relationships. And the vision is never really accomplished. I never am done courageously facilitating relationships. There's always more work to do. But it is clear. And I use that as a barometer to some extent to say, do I want to participate in this thing or that thing? And I have to filter it through that lens. And so we've been doing that over the holiday season with our own family. Is trying to give my children, I have an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and a 2-year-old, trying to give them some optimistic vision, even though for my son, soccer practice has been canceled. School has been canceled in many ways. Thanksgiving, in the way that we typically celebrate it, was not celebrated. And he's feeling this sense of frustration as he in his own way is experiencing trauma. And so my wife and I have been really trying to articulate what is the vision we have for our family? And how do we call our young children into that large, compelling vision? And so we've been talking a lot about laughter and listening and being innovative and helping instill in our children that's who we are. And so instead of calling them out when they act up, it's calling them in and saying, hey, that's not who we are as a family. We're more than that. We're more than that. And trying to create that vision for them. So before we move into the kind of Q&A, I just wanted to do some of my own kind of, as I've been doing, reflection on, so how do we lead during this season of, just total unrest, and what does that look like? And so a couple points I want to just take away to leave you with. Sometimes leaders talk and they shouldn't. And the best thing to do is just listen. And I say that from falling into that trap of, for myself, my father's African-American and my mom is white. And so, after the riots in Grand Rapids, I got just a ton of phone calls and text messages of people saying, hey, as someone who cares about race and cares about our city, what do you think? Should you say something? Can you do a podcast? Can you? And I just think that there was a period of time in which it was best to just be present in the moment, to absorb some of the realities of what were going on, to try to think through where was Jesus in all of this and what my call was before trying to jump in to share something. And so in many ways, this is one of the few times that I've tried to emerge from that longer period of reflection to say something, because I think leadership oftentimes, especially during times of crisis, can start with listening. Number 2, we are living in the apocalypse, or the apocalypsis is the Greek word, which is really just a time of revealing, time of unveiling of what is working and what is essential, and in many ways, who survives and who doesn't. Unfortunately, in the business community, out of this crisis, there are winners and there are losers. There are people who are surviving and people who are not during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what does that mean for you in terms of your leadership? What is it forming you to? Number 3, rhythms, relationships, and righteousness cannot be created or manipulated in times of crisis, but rather they are built before you need them. So let me start with rhythms. Rhythms are this idea that for me, I've been instituting for probably the past 5 years. A rhythm of reflection, a rhythm of discernment, a rhythm of action. A couple things that means. One is one day alone, by myself outside of my home or outside of my office, in which I can be present with myself and with God. Oftentimes that is half a day kind of being quiet and half a day of strategic planning. Other times it's journaling, it's going to the beach, it's putting in some form of rhythm that allows me to process what the heck is just happening. And what does that mean for me? And how should I behave? And to try to think that you're going to institute something like that immediately when there's a crisis is probably not true. It's the same thing as exercise or dieting, is that it's really hard to say, hey, I'm going to start dieting here during the holiday season. You have to have a better rhythm that you've already created before that thing hits. Second is relationships. One of the organizations that I'm a part of, or collaboratives, is called the Grand Rapids Center for Community Transformation. And we have a historically white global organization in partnership with a primarily African-American historical institution. And we are co-located in the same place. We've been doing this for approximately 6 years, building relationships between the two groups, between the staff, between the organizations. And in many ways, we see the value now of these relationships during the past year, and how now we've created a platform for real dialogue. We've had to have a monthly meeting in which we're able to process these things in relationship of what's happening in our world and what it means for us. How does it help us lead? What are we learning? And finally, 3, righteousness cannot be created or manipulated in times of crisis. Righteousness is this idea, the Hebrew word is the sadiq, or the sadakim. This was the just one, the one who has power, the one who has privilege and influence, and says, I'm willing to willingly give those things up, not government mandated, but because of my own soul work. I'm willing to give things up for the sake of others, for the sake of righteousness. And to think that all of a sudden now, in a time of crisis, that's necessarily going to compel you may not be true. But rather, how do you create righteousness? How do you create rhythms of righteousness for times of crisis? What does that look like for you? And finally, I'll end with kind of 7 characteristics that I think are the future of leadership for us to be thinking about. How are we instilling these things in our own? One is just humility. We see that to lead during this time takes multiple people in multiple sectors, that we don't know all the answers. We're solving multiple problems that we don't even necessarily know exactly what the question is. And so that does require humility. Number 2, again, collaborative, multi-sector, and global. How do we think about the global issues at hand, but also what are the local solutions? I think there's this idea of embracing diversity of all kinds. And I don't mean per se accepting or agreeing with, or I don't know, but it's the idea that diversity is here of all different kinds. And what does it mean for you to recognize that it's here to stay? How do you lead in a way that embraces the reality of the current situation and then sees God in it? 4, we've talked about this willingness to take greater risk and cut through the noise. Here's a great new Netflix film called The Social Dilemma that just talks about the echo chambers that we live in. There is so much noise, and to cut through some of the political noise, to cut through some of the agenda noise, and still speak truth is going to be increasingly required in today's world. 5, how are we cognizant of our own rivalry and scapegoating? So in the middle of all of this diversity, all of these different perspectives, how are we cognizant of our desire to want to blame others? I would say, what's the rivalry that wars within you? What is the rivalry that wars within you that wants to then scapegoat the other? Leaders have to be cognizant of what it is that is always stirring up inside of them. 6 has been a key point. Have a compelling and optimistic vision and express that. As you articulate that, how do we express that vision to our families, to our communities, that again, the Holy Spirit is doing something. and we get to join in. 7 is leaders have to be able to manage rapid change, that it's coming increasingly fast, or as I think Google CEO said a few months ago, we accomplished in 4 months what we couldn't accomplish in 10 years, is that the internet is now necessary for daily life. What does that rapid pace of change mean for us? And what's the rhythm, the relationships, and righteousness that we want to strive for as we think about the future that we want for our children and our children's children? So I'll go back as we end and move to the Q&A of the 2 questions that I started with that hopefully now we can have a discussion on. Is what dream for your community or family is emerging for you? In light of all of these changes, as you take a chance to kind of sit back and reflect, what is the optimistic dream that you have for your family in the midst of this formative or transformative time? And then number 2 is there a new lens that's been transforming your perspective? In the midst of all the many voices, have you taken some time to reflect and discern and say, how has those things influenced my beliefs or my actions? What new perspective is emerging? So excited to get to the Q&A. Hope you enjoyed the content and look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Justin, for introducing us to this idea of transformational leadership. For those of you who haven't asked a question or would like to ask a question, if you're watching on Facebook, you may enter questions there, or go to or send a question to digital@acton.org, and we'd be happy to ask your questions live with Justin. So Justin, as I was listening and pondering what you were talking about, leadership comes in many forms. And usually when you go to a bookstore or you hear leadership in popular culture, it's usually directed at the business leader or the political leader. But you really brought it down to, it includes and encompasses those, but also there's a real familial and even personal aspect to it. And your PhD and your doctorate and your research are in transformational leadership. Can you tell me a little bit about what that means? What is transformational leadership ultimately trying to differentiate itself from just kind of just regular leadership? What's the crux of the idea?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. I love it. And you know, it is like a catchy word now, transformational, and it's kind of in many ways become a buzzword. But for me, the way I look at transformational leadership is really being not a destination, but transformation being a process, right? And that process is formative, and it first and foremost is I would say individual. It's the deep soul work, or as my kind of early formative years were formed in social work, and there's this idea of you can only take someone else as far as you have gone yourself, right? In a therapeutic relationship per se. And so I think the same now is trying to transfer that idea of into business, into family, right? Is that you can only lead someone as far as you've been willing to go. And so there's this great quote that I often use by Franciscan priest Richard Rohr, just talks about, you know, we transmit the wounds that we don't transform. And it's this idea that we've all been deeply wounded, and we have a tendency then to mask those wounds and transmit them into our businesses, our organizations, our families, right? It's hurt people, hurt organizations, hurt people who work there for them, and acknowledging all of that and the realities of that, working through them to find healing in them, and then leading from that deep place of vulnerability, which takes higher levels of courage. So it's a process versus a destination. It's inward looking versus only external.
Thank you. That's good. At Acton here, one of our core values is thinking about what does it mean to be a human person, anthropology. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? How do we interact with ourselves, with our families, and in society? And I think you study this. There's a buzzword out there now, dignity, or this concept of the alienation of the self from so many other institutions. And what do you think right now? You've keyed in on a lot of mega trends, and then near the end of your talk, you talk about just 2020. What a strange year. You have the major racial tensions. We have COVID-19 in all of its facets: economic, personal, relational, psychological. The devastation that's there. I mean, what are some real what changes need to happen tangibly? I guess is there one or two things that you think about, that are some core changes that you think need to happen to help leaders of all stripes think through this really strange time?
Yeah. Yeah. What a great question. This idea too of the dignity of the human person. And what does that mean as we think about, a lot of times we talk about Jesus as God, but sometimes miss, Jesus as human, and Jesus frees us to be fully human. There's an organization a global kind of organization that I'm a part of that works with grassroots leaders throughout urban cities across the globe. And we talk about these paradigm shifts that we see as core to being embodied within the leader and within an organization and ultimately a city for, in many ways, the healing of cities. And I think now more than ever, those ring true. One of them is this idea of how do we move from this ideology of scarcity to one of abundance. And so we see this now, right? It's always been there. And it doesn't matter if you're materially rich or poor, you can have a scarcity mentality that is thinking about a zero-sum game and how do I get more for myself versus understanding that we have to start from the place of God's yes, God's place of abundance. So I would say that's one major shift is how do we not think about what is mine when it comes to partnerships, relationships, the way that I would say, real change happens at the pace of deep relationships. That requires an abundance mentality. The second one is, and I mentioned it, is this idea of moving away from rivalry to one of peacemaking. And rivalry has been there for years. It's the way our societies operate, is that when there becomes tension, we need to find a scapegoat. We need someone to blame, Jesus becoming the ultimate, to really reveal to us our own rivalry. And so a lot of times I ask the question, and in order to move through that process ourselves, we have to ask ourselves, what is the rivalry that is warring within ourselves? What are we defending and why? And are we defending it at what cost? Versus peacemaking is different than peacekeeping. It doesn't mean that we're not addressing difficult issues, but it is understanding that the goal is shalom. And then the third one I would say is this idea of kind of theory from above to incarnational practice, one that moves not just from the ivory towers, but has a real depth of local presence, one that is not just programs, but that one is present with people. And I would say specifically has an understanding of those people who are on the margins. What does that look like as we act and move in our day-to-day?
Thank you for that. We have a question from the audience. This one comes from Phil, and I think it relates to what you're talking about. You talked about your personal or family vision statement, that not only an organization needs a mission statement, but also families and people can develop that. He asks, what exercises or tools can you recommend to help someone articulate their vision? Are there books or tools that you can help people help point people towards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if we've necessarily, read any particular books, although there is one that I've kind of just started called The Other Half of the Church. And it is beginning to address even the concept of joy and the way that laughter works. And I think I shared that as being one of our kind of values is laughter. During this kind of traumatizing time, laughter becomes a really big healing mechanism. I don't necessarily think that there's a right way to do this. In general, I would say vision statements, you want them to be something that can easily be memorized, something that's 5 to 7 words, and something that's compelling. An exercise I've used through just consulting with organizations more so than with families is just taking sticky notes and allowing people to write the words, depending if it's age appropriate for you to do this. Just write words that kind of embody your values. And then you can do this exercise called voting with your feet, where you give each person you put all of those, write as many as you can on sticky notes, put them on a whiteboard somewhere. Each person then gets 3 dot stickers that they have to vote on the words that seem to mean the most to your family. And you begin to whittle that down, and then you can choose one. But I think more importantly, it's the process of engaging your family in an intentional way that begins to really help us live into a larger identity during this season is just really important.
And don't you really think that I mean, you talked about this action, discernment, reflection, rotation. I mean, a lot of us don't slow down enough, whether it's in our businesses or our family strata we're in. I mean, the discernment and reflection piece, while endemically human, is really hard to do. The modern world seems to take the speed at which we are going. It really makes those ideas hard. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Yeah, I mean, the research is saying just by email volume that every year our email volume increases by 30%.
Yeah.
And most people don't have a strategy for how you're going to even deal with that increase of email, right? And I think the same is true for families, for reflecting. We have information just overload, and it's kind of this like, how do we filter all of that? How do we make sense of all of it? How do we take time to have our own thoughts and be creative? The only way to do it is just to do it, like and to see the benefits of getting away from the noise, to be present with yourself and see what surfaces, and be alone with those demons long enough that it transforms you. I mean, it's very scary to be alone if you haven't done it for a while. To be silent for 3 hours seems like the strangest thing. But I have just increasingly tried to make it a habit. Last year I got a chance to take 6 weeks. I didn't think it was possible, but I took 6 weeks off of work. 3 of those days were in complete silence. And the clarity that emerged from me being in that time alone and being able to face now this season, I credit it to that time off and the time and silence of really being able to hear from God and wrestle with my own things. But yes, it's hard.
So, I mean, you could even, if you think about the season, Advent, as Christians, many of our participants are, believers, and we're in the season of Advent, and the incarnation of Christ seems to speak to this, the theological rhythm of Advent. I mean, do you find engagement in or thinking differently about it in this era of Advent than the next few weeks, thinking about what leads to Christmas?
Yeah. It's such a beautiful time, and
my fear is that for some, the lack of normalcy will rob us from this beautiful period of time that we're in, where we celebrate more than anything above family and presence and gathering. Those are symbolic, in many ways, expressions of what we're celebrating. But the reality of the God-man, right? The God with all power and privilege, or as some would say, the downward spiral of wrapping himself in flesh, or as the message says in John, right? Jesus moves into the neighborhood, this act of presence. And that we as believers, Christ in us, to be present in the world. But it's really hard to be present in the world when we're not even present with ourselves. And I think this time is such a great reminder for us to really recognize what the incarnation means. I had a great friend in Guatemala, and I asked him, he kept talking about, incarnation and incarnational leadership. And this was probably 7-8 years. I said, what does that mean to you? And he said, it means that the most important thing is to be here with you right now. That the incarnation frees us to move away from living out of fear to live in freedom, and to be present right here, right now, to be quiet enough in our souls that we recognize that the joy of the Lord is here in this moment, in which we get to experience Christ in others. What a beautiful gift this season is as we anticipate Christmas.
Absolutely. I'm always intrigued. You brought up the idea of integrity several times in your talk. And we know integrity, the root is wholeness, this idea of being whole or consistent. We've seen some both in the Christian leadership world of nonprofits and churches. It's not new, but the last year there's been some colossal failures, and the business world is full of anecdotes as well. What do you think? I mean, have you had to deal with personally in your own life, whether through leadership on the boards of organizations or other friends that are leaders? How do you help people transition or think through what leadership failure looks like, or why people fail, and how you work through a process? When you talk about transformational leadership, leadership is a really difficult thing. Yeah. And what are some, do you have an anecdote for helping through the poor choices people make as leaders and the effects both and their organizations?
Yeah. Well, I think it's real. I mean, I think, we all have vices and virtues. And especially in times of trauma, in times of crisis, there is a tendency to run towards your vices. And we see that, right? We see that in the data. We see that in suicide rates and alcohol use and domestic violence. We see that with people's, financial interactions, and as people are wrestling familiar organizationally, what to do with, the pandemic and crisis. And I think that's the point. That kind of point number 3 is like the rhythms, relationships, and righteousness. You can't really just create all of a sudden. The game is on now, and if you haven't been practicing, then it's more of a challenge. I do think the process of action, reflection, discernment, and to instill into your daily life. And for me, that also, the discernment part is in community, and that's like where the accountability comes into play, right? That's your small group, that's your church, that's your one-on-one mentorship that you have, that you're receiving, that you're not doing this in an isolated vacuum. You don't lead by yourself. That's not the reality of how it works. It's surrounding yourself and being vulnerable enough prior to crises to allow people into your soul and to speak into you. I think that rhythm for me is I do find myself when I get out of that rhythm, that how much I actually crave it and miss it. And when I kind of jump back into having a day alone, I recognize, ooh, there's some stuff in there that maybe I was kind of leaning towards that I've missed. So I think, again, the processes and developing processes and rhythms allow us to be held, to be sustained in times of crisis. So it's never too late, but I think that's the reality, is put those things in place. And you know, there's lots of talk and books written about accountability and what that looks like. And it really is, again, that's about relationship for me. Are you willing to be vulnerable enough with other people that you let them into the realities of your soul? And that's what leadership is really about, is to go to those places that, at least for many men, the biggest fear is like to be found out that you're somehow a fraud, right? And so people cake on layers of protection in the wall, and they end up leading from a place that really is all about what they think other people want of them instead of what God has called them to be. So yeah, it's an important thing, and it's real.
Yeah. We have one more question from the listening audience. David is from Belize in Central America. He says, great presentation. Yeah, he's the dean of a small liberal arts college, and he wants to get connected with you. He thinks this is great. We'll send on his email to you. But he asks, when you mention accepting diversity, are you referring to a culture of dialogue and collaboration in line with what Pope Francis expounds on in his most recent encyclical? So I don't know if you've read that or have engaged that at all, but is it the culture of dialogue and collaboration a part of what you're thinking about?
Yeah, I haven't read the encyclical. I've heard a little bit about it, and I figured this conversation at some point somebody would ask that question. So I'm glad that I'm glad that you did. And I'm not even sure. Part of it, the reason I put it in there was for the sake of dialogue. I mean, I think that is where we want the conversation to go, and it's probably more about the embracing of people than it is about agendas, is what I would say. And when I mean diversity is here, right? That's of people, that's of ideas, that's of politics, that's of economic and political policy. It is the realities that our cities are becoming increasingly diverse and mixed, and there's all of these things around. And I think the sooner we can come to grips with reality, the sooner we're going to be able to have meaningful dialogue about those things. It's what is the opportunity to be the incarnation in the midst of all of the stuff? What does that mean? How am I at peace with myself that I'm not scapegoating others, right? That's the challenge, is that if we're not at peace with ourselves, we scapegoat someone else. It doesn't matter who the other is. That's just the way that the world works. But if peacemaking and shalom and flourishing of all people is the goal, then what type of conversation might we have with someone, or partnership might we build, even if it is with someone that we, disagree with on policy or agenda? So it is, let's say, people first is at the heart of it. It's oftentimes it's the motivation behind that. And so, as a transformative leader, I think it is increasingly important to set tables that you're able to be principled yet adaptive, to understand your principles, but also have relationships that allow you to hear other people as well. And that's what we want, right? That's what Acton is about, is having diverse dialogue and bringing in voices and having the conversations, even if there's not complete alignment. That's okay. Letting that be increasingly the norm.
Absolutely. It's I think we want to focus on what are the right questions to be asking, not necessarily the right answers. And I think that can be a buzzword, a buzz phrase at times. But what you mentioned mega trends in your talk. Is there one or two that you think is most impactful in maybe the Grand Rapids context or even the American context? Do you see one or two trends that is most cutting edge or will have the most strongest effect in the next 5 to 10 years, if we can take that time frame? Is there one of those mega trends that you think is that your eye is on or you're interested in?
I mean, I think the automation of things in 5G, I mean, it's like that was a 10-year projection of 30% of the global workforce being
right.
displaced. I think that's already happened and happening, right? It's sped up. It's not a 10-year projection anymore. It's like in the next 3 years, that is the reality as 5G rolls out all across and allows for, automated cars and working from home and now, in terms of COVID and safety and social distancing, that has been ramped up. And I think we already see it is that the effects of this is that they do disproportionately affect those who are already poor and vulnerable.
Right.
And so in many ways for those, like me, who I can work from home, I can do Zooms, I can do lots of stuff from my house and with my computer. That's not the case for the reality of billions of people. And so I think that's both local and global is what does that look like? And in many ways, it's still hidden, at least in Grand Rapids in the US, where you see there is some pain and there is some suffering, but it's been propped up by, stimulus packages and philanthropy, as people have responded to the crisis as it's a disaster. And so we're doing stuff. There's food and clothes and, dollars for the businesses. What happens long term as those things and those businesses close down permanently, I think are a much bigger challenge that I am concerned about.
That's good. I was talking with an economic historian from Oxford recently, and he wrote a great little book called The Technology Trap. And it is fantastic. But one thing he mentioned is when we talk about short-term and long-term, what we forget is short-term in the different industrial revolutions was anywhere from 2 to 3 generations.
Yeah.
So short-term isn't 2 years.
Yeah.
Short-term is 20 to 70 years.
Yeah.
And what do we do with those vulnerable populations? Great insights. Well, Justin, what a pleasure to have you. Thank you for the work you do here in Grand Rapids and the impact beyond the city itself. Thank you for spending your time and your expertise to develop and talk with us about this. For those of you who have participated, thank you so much for your engagement, your questions. In the near future, we will be publishing the Acton Lecture Series list for 2021. So be on the lookout for that. And please enjoy the season as best you can with your family in the strangeness. And like Justin said, laugh a little. Try to find the areas of hope and enjoyment with those who are around you. And on behalf of the Acton Institute, our executives and the staff that work hard to bring these ideas to you, thank you very much. And we hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.